Guess you're really ready for a war. Well, this is chapter 19, Seizing an Empire. And after the Civil War in 1865, we really didn't get too involved in overseas endeavors much. Most of what was going on, we were dealing with the South and how it was destroyed during the war. And didn't have a whole lot of time and money and energy involved overseas, but that's going to change by the later part of the 1800s and into the 1900s. This period of time, chapter 19, Seizing an Empire, is going to be about imperialism and how we started getting involved in other countries. Here we are in 2017 soon, or if by the time you watch this, we'll be in 2017, and we have forces all over the world as we speak. But back at that time, in the late part of the 1800s, Great Britain was really the empire country in the world. And before that, we had places like France, Spain, Portugal, and even Germany had overseas colonies. Alfred Mahan was one of the admirals in the U.S. Navy in the late 1800s, and he wrote a book called Influence of Sea Power Upon History, and it dealt with naval power and how if we want to be a world domination, we've got to have a stronger Navy. And because of that book, the influence of it was that the U.S. government, Congress, and the military decided that he was right. We'll have to build more ships, better ships, to be able to compete in faraway places. One of the first, confrontations that we would have would be with Spain, and this would be part of the Spanish-American War in 1898. At that time, the Spanish-American War got off the ground because Spain was involved in two places in particular that we would get involved in. One is Cuba, and the other one was halfway around the world in the Philippines. They controlled both of those places. We sent a ship called the Maine into Cuba, and when it got close to the Havana harbor, it blew up. Eventually, we found out it was probably due to an internal explosion in the boiler room, but of course the press got a hold of this and said that the Spanish destroyed our ship, the Maine, and it sunk. Yellow press was a big thing during this time. Whenever you hear that term, yellow press, we're talking about sensationalization of the media, making a story into something bigger than it really is. And the person that was really responsible for that was William Randolph Hearst, because it sold newspapers, and Joseph Pulitzer was part of that too. The other thing that got us dragged into the war with Spain at this time was a letter that was written called the Delome Letter. It was a Spanish representative, foreign minister, that wrote this letter, and in the letter it was intercepted, and he called our president, President McKinley, a weak and uncertain president. And back then that hurt a lot of people's feelings, especially McKinley's, I'm sure, but a lot of Americans are ready to go to war because you're talking about our president. Eventually the Cubans are going to get independence and be an independent country, and then of course 50 years later they're going to turn communist under Fidel Castro. The Spanish are going to leave, but you can still see the influence of Spain and Cuba, as the main language, for instance, is Spanish. In the Philippines, it was a little bit different situation. The Filipino War, which is part of the Spanish-American War, took place a couple of years later, around 1902, and it lasted a little bit longer. We sent Dewey, who was one of our top commanders in the Navy over there, to attack at Manila Bay, and we would defeat the Spanish in the Philippines with the help of some of the Filipino guerrillas led by a fellow named Emilio Aguinaldo. Aguinaldo is the George Washington, I guess you could call him, of the Philippines. And once we got rid of the Spanish from the Philippines, things were a little bit different there. The Filipinos decided they wanted us to leave too. We had left for the most part in Cuba, but in the Philippines, we decided we wanted to stay around and make the Philippines a U.S. territory, a great place to fuel up ships on the way to the Far East, set up a military base there, and while the Filipinos would have nothing to do with that. So we ended up, after we kicked off the Spanish, going to war with the Filipinos. And this bloody war dragged out, like I said, for several years. Thousands of people died, mostly from disease that they got. Yellow fever was of course a big one. Then we had a confrontation with the Chinese, the Boxer Rebellion. There were a group of Chinese who wanted immigrants, all immigrants, not just Americans, out of the country, and this led to what was called the Boxer Rebellion. It was an uprising to get rid of all the foreigners in China. Eventually, we would sign an agreement called the Open Door Policy, or Open Door Agreement, with China to allow open trade between China and other countries, but it was slow going at first because of the Boxer Rebellion. In Central America, we also got involved at this time in Panama. Actually, Colombia controlled the area where today's Panama Canal is, and some of the people living in Colombia wanted independence and formed their own country. So they got our help. We went in with our soldiers. We helped the rebels in Colombia to win independence. They formed their own country called Panama, and then we made a deal with them to put the Panama Canal through, which was eventually completed in 1914. About a 70-mile stretch through the jungle, which connected the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, and it saved us thousands of miles shipping from going around the tip of South America and then off to the Pacific. One of the terms that became pretty popular during this time was by Roosevelt was "speak softly and carry a big stick." In other words, build up a strong military, speak in a soft tone, like you're not really going to do a whole lot of damage, but you have the power behind you. You've got the ships, you've got the ammunition, you've got the strong military. So basically, don't mess with us. If you know we look tough, then other countries won't bother with us. And this kind of became the prevailing thought for a long time. Also, the Roosevelt Corollary. When Teddy Roosevelt was president, this gave us more police power in Latin America, which was an extension, really, of the Monroe Doctrine back in the early 1800s. Finally, a couple points to think about. It's hard to hold an empire. I think when you look at Britain and what happened with them over the last 150 years. At one time, they controlled Canada, Australia, of course, the United States, and many other places. India comes to mind. Is that something that's just going to disappear? I mean, these countries are falling one by one. Are we going to get to a point where there's no real influence from an empire anymore? And is that just not a goal that countries have? And is it too expensive of a thing to even consider? And secondly, when you look at the yellow journalism and Hearst and Pulitzer, is the press truthful for the most part? Or certainly there is a slant in the news coverage. You look at CNN, and no matter what people think, it's a somewhat of a liberal slant versus, for instance, Fox News, ABC, NBC, CBS, MSNBC, radio station talk shows, even some of the internet sites. I mean, how do we know things are truthful in reporting? Is there a way to know that?